Imagine the excitement of a young boy, ready to reunite with his father after months apart. But what if, in a place meant for journeys, he suddenly feels like he doesn't belong? Lorenzo, just 10 years old, is about to face a moment that will change his life and the lives of everyone around him. Make sure to subscribe and like. Also comment from where are you watching 321. Lorenzo clutched his backpack tightly as he and his Aunt Belinda made their way through the crowded airport. His eyes darted around, taking in the hustle and bustle, the polished shoes and the business suits that seemed to surround him. This was his first time flying without his parents, and the unfamiliar setting only added to his nervousness. "Are you okay, buddy?" his Aunt Belinda asked, noticing his anxious expression. Her voice was gentle, soothing, just like always. Lorenzo nodded but bit his lip. "Yeah, I think so. I'm just a little nervous, I guess." He paused, glancing around at the well-dressed travelers bustling through the terminal, many of whom didn't even notice them. "Do you think we should have dressed up more?" Belinda smiled, patting his shoulder reassuringly. "Sweetie, we're here to be comfortable, not to impress anyone. It's a long flight, and all that matters is that we're together." She bent down to meet his eyes. "And remember, we're going to see your dad. Isn't that worth being a little nervous?" Lorenzo nodded, managing a small smile, but a knot of self-consciousness still twisted in his stomach. With so many unfamiliar faces and such hurried energy all around him, he couldn't help but feel out of place. As they reached their gate and sat in the stiff plastic chairs, Lorenzo tried to settle his nerves. His aunt's words helped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't quite belong here, in this polished world of airports and travelers. After a while, the loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing their boarding group. Lorenzo's heart thudded with a mix of excitement and anxiety as they made their way onto the plane. Inside, everything felt even closer, and the noise of chatter and luggage stowing filled his ears. He clung to Aunt Belinda's hand as they shuffled down the narrow aisle. Finally, they reached their row, and Belinda pointed to the window seat. "You can have the window, buddy. How about that?" Lorenzo's face lit up. "Really? Thanks, Aunt Belinda." He slid into the seat eagerly, pressing his nose against the cool window to watch the tiny baggage cart zip around outside. Everything looked so different from this view, and for a moment he felt a flicker of excitement pushing his worries aside. Next to him sat an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She introduced herself as Mrs. Willow, and soon they were chatting easily about Lorenzo's trip and his plans to see his dad. Talking to Mrs. Willow made Lorenzo feel a little more comfortable, and he started to relax. Just as Lorenzo was beginning to feel at ease, he remembered the book he'd packed. "Aunt Belinda," he whispered, "I forgot my book. Can I get it real quick?" Belinda nodded. "Of course, sweetie. Just be careful." Lorenzo unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, reaching for his backpack in the overhead compartment. But before he could even grab it, he heard a sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Sit down immediately," snapped a flight attendant. Her tone was cold and stern, and Lorenzo froze, his hand hovering over his backpack. He turned to see a woman with a tense expression staring directly at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He was just getting his book," Belinda interjected, keeping her voice calm. "I don't want to hear excuses," the flight attendant shot back. "Control your child. This kind of behavior is unacceptable." Belinda's eyes widened in disbelief, but she tried to keep her tone respectful. "Ma'am, I understand you have a job to do, but he was simply reaching for his book. There's no need to speak to him that way." "Maybe you shouldn't be flying if you can't follow simple instructions," the attendant replied, her voice dripping with disdain. She turned and walked briskly to the front of the plane, leaving Lorenzo and Belinda in shocked silence. A murmur spread through the nearby passengers, a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. Lorenzo sank lower in his seat, cheeks burning with embarrassment. He could feel the stares of other passengers, and he wished more than anything that he could just disappear. A few moments later, the flight attendant returned with two security officers. She looked down at Lorenzo and Belinda with a hardened gaze. "You both need to leave the plane. Now." As they were escorted down the aisle, Lorenzo's mind raced with confusion and shame. Lorenzo and Belinda sat side by side at the gate, numb and shaken from what had just happened. The noisy, bustling world of the airport moved around them, but it felt distant, like they were trapped in a bubble of disbelief. Lorenzo's small frame shook slightly, his face red and eyes puffy from trying to hold back tears. Belinda put her arm around him, her face calm, but with a tension in her eyes he hadn't seen before. "It's going to be okay, Lorenzo," she whispered, steadying her own voice to soothe him. "We're going to make this right. You did nothing wrong. Remember that." Lorenzo looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "But, Aunt Belinda, why did they do that to us? We didn't do anything bad." Hearing the pain and confusion in his voice, Belinda's heart ached. She tightened her grip on his shoulders, trying to shield him from the world, at least for a moment. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people make unfair judgments about others because of how they look or dress. It's wrong, and we're not going to let them get away with it." Lorenzo's eyes stayed fixed on her, but a tiny spark of hope began to replace some of the fear and sadness. She gave him a small smile, then straightened up, a look of determination flashing across her face. "Stay here with our bags for a minute, okay? I need to make an important call." Lorenzo nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. As Belinda stepped away, he watched her scroll through her phone and press a number, her face set with fierce resolve. She paced back and forth, gesturing with her free hand as she spoke in a low, intense tone. He couldn't hear her words, but he could tell she was fighting for them, fighting to make sure they didn't have to feel this way again. Seeing her, he felt a bit of his own strength returning. After a few minutes, Belinda returned, kneeling beside him again. "That was Mr. Smith, a good friend of mine," she explained softly. "He's furious about what happened and is going to make some calls to help us." "What's going to happen now, Aunt Belinda?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and worry. "We're going to stand up for ourselves," she said firmly, holding his gaze. "This isn't just about us. If we stay quiet, other people might face the same thing. We're going to make sure this stops here." Lorenzo nodded slowly, still nervous but feeling a strange sense of pride. Aunt Belinda was right. What had happened to them wasn't fair, and it wasn't okay. They needed to speak up, not just for themselves, but for others too. As they waited at the gate, something happened that neither of them expected. A woman named Sarah, who had been seated a few rows behind them, had recorded the entire incident on her phone. Her video captured the tense moment when Stephanie had yelled at Lorenzo, their walk down the aisle with security, and the look of shame on Lorenzo's face as he clutched his aunt's hand. She couldn't believe what she'd witnessed, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Sarah posted the video to her social media account, adding a heartfelt message about the unfairness of what had happened. "I can't believe what I just saw," she wrote. "This young boy and his aunt were treated so unfairly, all because of a snap judgment. We can't stay silent about things like this." Within minutes, her video started gaining traction as people shared it with friends, commenting their outrage and disbelief. Hashtags like #Justice for Lorenzo and #Airline Discrimination began to trend, with thousands of people expressing their anger and calling for action. Back at the gate, unaware of the firestorm brewing online, Lorenzo and Belinda were approached by a well-dressed man in a suit, his name tag identifying him as Mr. Johnson, the airline's manager. His face was full of concern, and he approached them cautiously, as if sensing the tension surrounding them. "Miss Williams, Mr. Lorenzo," he began, slightly out of breath. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened to you. This was unacceptable, and we'd like to make it right." He gestured toward the boarding area. "Please let us offer you both upgraded seats in first class on the next available flight." Belinda stood, her posture straight and her gaze steady. Lorenzo watched her, feeling the familiar strength in her voice as she replied, "Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your quick response, but this isn't something a first-class seat can fix. What happened goes far beyond an inconvenience." Mr. Johnson looked uncertain but nodded, his expression earnest. "Of course I understand. We take incidents like this very seriously, and I can assure you there will be a thorough investigation. I'll personally see that disciplinary action is taken against the staff involved." Belinda's expression softened only slightly, but her voice was still firm. "Mr. Johnson, this isn't just about your staff's behavior. This incident is part of a larger problem, and that needs to be addressed. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I've handled too many cases like this. Real change is overdue, and I intend to take legal action, not only for us, but for anyone who has faced this kind of treatment. Lorenzo felt a surge of pride as he listened to her speak. He knew his aunt wasn't going to let anyone brush this under the rug. She was standing up for him, for both of them, and for people they didn't even know. It was daunting, but it also filled him with a new sense of purpose. As they waited for their next flight, Lorenzo and Belinda had no idea that their story was already spreading across the country. Sarah's video had gone viral, capturing the attention of social media influencers, news outlets, and even celebrities who shared their outrage. People from all walks of life were commenting, their words a powerful blend of anger, empathy, and determination. "How can they treat a child like that?" one user wrote, echoing the disbelief of thousands. "This airline needs to make some real changes." Back at the gate, Lorenzo was curled up in a chair, lost in a new book his aunt had bought him from the airport shop. Beside him, Belinda was busy on her laptop, drafting a formal complaint against the airline. Though they were focused on their immediate next steps, they had no idea that millions of people were already demanding justice on their behalf. Lorenzo looked up at his aunt, a question lingering on his lips. Do you think anything will really change because of what happened to us?" Belinda looked at him, her eyes softening. "I hope so, Lorenzo. Sometimes it just takes one voice to start a chorus." And unknown to them, their voice had already become that chorus, echoing across a nation ready for change. Belinda and Lorenzo were only beginning to understand the impact of their story. As they sat in their hotel room the night after the flight, Belinda's phone buzzed continuously with notifications, messages from friends, family, and strangers who had seen the viral video and were reaching out with words of support. Lorenzo watched his aunt's face as she read the messages, a mix of anger and encouragement flashing in her eyes. "Aunt Belinda," Lorenzo began, his voice tentative, "why are so many people talking about us?" Belinda looked over at him, setting her phone down. "Sweetheart, what happened to us was wrong, and people are finally starting to see that. They're speaking up for us, standing with us, because they know that what we faced was unfair." Lorenzo nodded slowly, still processing. It felt strange that so many people he didn't even know, cared about their story. "Are we going to keep fighting this?" he asked softly. Belinda's gaze softened, but her voice was resolute. "Yes, Lorenzo. We're going to make sure no one else has to feel what you felt that day. It won't be easy, but we're not alone in this." I spoke with some civil rights organizations, and they want to help us with our case. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Lorenzo felt a mix of pride and worry. It was a big responsibility, but he trusted his aunt. He knew she wouldn't let him down. In the days that followed, Belinda and Lorenzo found themselves at the center of a growing movement. They launched an online campaign called Fly Fair, aiming to raise awareness about racial discrimination in air travel. With the help of the Civil Rights Coalition, they created a platform where people could share their own experiences. And soon, hundreds of stories began to pour in from travelers who had faced similar treatment. Each story painted a picture of the injustices that often went unseen. Lorenzo watched as his aunt worked tirelessly on the campaign, organizing meetings, consulting with lawyers, and speaking with supporters. He admired her strength and focus, even on days when he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Late one evening, she sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents. Lorenzo joined her, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Aunt Belinda, do you ever get scared?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Belinda looked at him, surprised by his question. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Yes, sweetie. There are times when I feel overwhelmed, just like you do. But I remember why we're doing this. I think about you and everyone else who might face this kind of treatment, and I know we can't give up. Sometimes standing up for what's right is the only choice we have." Her words gave him strength, and he nodded, feeling a spark of courage reignite within him. "Then I want to help too, however I can." Belinda smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You already are, Lorenzo. Just by being brave and sharing your story, you're helping more than you know." As the Fly Fair campaign continued to gain traction, media outlets began requesting interviews with Lorenzo and Belinda. At first, Lorenzo was hesitant, nervous about speaking in front of cameras. The thought of being in the public eye made him feel exposed, like all his insecurities were on display. But with his aunt's encouragement, he began to realize that his voice could make a real difference. One day they received an invitation from a local middle school to speak to the students about standing up against injustice. When Belinda told him about the opportunity, Lorenzo's eyes widened with both excitement and fear. Me? Speak to other kids? He stammered. Belinda knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Lorenzo, you've been so strong, sharing your story with the world. This is a chance to share it with kids your age, to let them know they can make a difference too. After a moment, Lorenzo took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. On the day of the speech, Lorenzo's hands were clammy, and he clung to Belinda's hand as they walked into the school auditorium. The sight of so many young faces looking up at him made his heart race. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone, glancing over at his aunt for reassurance. She gave him a warm smile, mouthing the words, "You've got this." "Hi, I'm Lorenzo," he began, his voice shaking a little. "A few weeks ago, I was just a regular kid like you. But then something happened that changed everything." He went on to describe the experience on the plane, the confusion and pain he felt when they were removed for no reason. The more he spoke, the more his voice steadied, his words finding their rhythm. "It wasn't right, and I realized that staying quiet wouldn't help anyone," he said, his voice growing stronger. "So, with my Aunt Belinda, I decided to speak up, and now we're working to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The students were captivated, leaning forward in their seats. Some even nodded along, their eyes wide with empathy. As he finished, he looked out at the crowd, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't felt before. Standing up for himself, for others, was worth every ounce of courage he'd found along the way. After his speech, the students erupted in applause, and a few even had tears in their eyes. As Lorenzo stepped down from the microphone, Belinda wrapped him in a tight hug, her own eyes shining with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Lorenzo," she whispered. "Your voice is powerful. You're making a real difference." From that day forward, Lorenzo embraced his role as an advocate, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. Each new person who heard it became part of the movement, and together they amplified their call for change. As their campaign gained momentum, Lorenzo began receiving messages from people all over the world. Kids his age thanked him for speaking up, telling him that his bravery had inspired them to confront unfair treatment in their own lives. Even adults reached out, sharing their gratitude and admiration for his courage. One night after a particularly moving interview, Lorenzo looked at Belinda, a newfound determination in his eyes. "Aunt Belinda, I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that day. We're going to keep fighting this, aren't we?" Belinda smiled, her heart full of pride and love for her nephew. "Yes, Lorenzo, we're going to keep fighting until everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." The day of the trial arrived with a sense of gravity that neither Lorenzo nor Belinda could ignore. As they approached the courthouse, they were met with a crowd of supporters holding signs and chanting words of encouragement. The scene felt surreal to Lorenzo. Strangers had come together to stand up for him, to support him in a battle he never imagined he would face. Belinda squeezed his hand gently as they climbed the courthouse steps together, her eyes shining with quiet determination. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager to witness this fight for justice. Reporters lined the walls and cameras flashed as Lorenzo and Belinda took their seats. The air was thick with tension, and Lorenzo's heart raced. He stole a quick glance at his aunt, who sat beside him, her face calm and steady. Her confidence gave him strength. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and the proceedings began. Belinda was the first to take the floor, standing tall and addressing the jury with a voice that was clear, controlled, and full of conviction. She spoke directly to the heart of the matter, stating plainly that Lorenzo had been wrongfully removed from the flight because of how he looked. She told the story from start to finish, her words painting a vivid picture of the humiliation and pain Lorenzo had endured. "Ladies and gentlemen," Belinda began, her gaze moving from one juror to the next, "this case isn't just about a single boy being treated unfairly. It's about a culture that allows assumptions and prejudices to dictate how people are treated." Lorenzo was judged before he even spoke a word. Judged because of his appearance, because of his background, and that judgment led to his public humiliation. As she spoke, her voice wavered only slightly, just enough to reveal the depth of her emotion. Lorenzo watched her with awe, feeling a swell of pride. She was fighting not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that judged them unfairly. When Belinda finished her statement, the airline's legal team took their turn, attempting to paint the incident as a misunderstanding. They claimed that the flight attendant, Stephanie, had only been following protocol and that any disruption had simply been a matter of safety. Belinda remained unfazed, listening carefully as each argument was presented. Then, when it was her turn again, she dismantled their defense with a calm precision that was both impressive and devastating. If this was about protocol, she countered, her voice firm, then why was Lorenzo the only passenger questioned? Why were he and his aunt singled out while others around them faced no scrutiny? The airline's legal team shifted uncomfortably. Belinda continued, presenting a series of statistics and case studies, each one underscoring a troubling pattern of discrimination. This was not an isolated incident, she argued. This was part of a larger issue, a pervasive problem that went far beyond a single flight. As the case progressed, the court called upon witnesses who had been present on the flight. Mrs. Willow, the kind elderly woman who had sat behind Lorenzo, took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she began her testimony. Her voice, though soft, was full of emotion as she recounted the events of that day. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, she said, her voice cracking. That young boy did nothing wrong. He was just trying to get his book, and yet he was treated like a troublemaker. I sat right behind him, helpless, as they were escorted off. It broke my heart to see the look on his face, the confusion, the shame. Her testimony was followed by other passengers who had also witnessed the incident. Each person shared their perspective, and with every story, the case against the airline grew stronger. It was clear to everyone in the room that Lorenzo and Belinda had been wronged, and that their removal from the plane had been based on nothing more than baseless assumptions. Finally, the judge called Lorenzo to the stand. As he made his way to the witness box, the room fell silent. His small frame looked even smaller against the backdrop of the courtroom, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He took a deep breath, glancing once more at his aunt, who gave him an encouraging nod. The lawyer approached him gently. Lorenzo, can you tell us what happened on that day? Lorenzo swallowed, his voice trembling as he began to speak. He described how excited he had been to see his dad, how he had tried to be polite to everyone around him. He recounted his confusion when Stephanie had first reprimanded him, and how ashamed he felt as he was escorted down the aisle. I didn't understand what I had done wrong, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I was just trying to get my book. He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. It made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was different, and that was bad. His voice broke slightly, but he continued, speaking about the pain of being treated as less than everyone else, just because of how he looked. As he finished, a silence fell over the room. The jury looked visibly moved, some nodding in understanding, while others looked down, seemingly reflecting on his words. Lorenzo's simple, honest account had touched them in a way no argument or statistic could. The lawyer then asked him about the aftermath, the viral video, the public attention, and his decision to stand up for himself and others. Lorenzo took a steadying breath. At first I was scared, he admitted. I didn't want people to talk about me or look at me. But then I realized that this wasn't just about me. Other people go through this too, and if we don't speak up, nothing will change. The sincerity in his words was undeniable. He looked out into the courtroom, his young voice steady. It's not right to judge people by how they look or what they wear. Everyone deserves respect. That's why we're here, to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. When Lorenzo finished, there was a profound silence. His testimony had struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even the airline's legal team looked visibly uncomfortable, their arguments seeming to wane in the face of such genuine emotion. Your Honor, he began, the airline would like to propose a settlement. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lorenzo's heart leaped as he turned to look at his aunt. Belinda's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she quickly regained her composure. She squeezed Lorenzo's hand, her eyes full of quiet strength. This was what they had fought for, and now it was within reach. The judge nodded, turning to Belinda. Counselor, what are your terms? Belinda rose from her seat, her voice steady and clear. Your Honor, our terms are simple but essential. First, we require mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all airline staff, from the CEO down to the ground crew. Second, we request the establishment of a scholarship fund for minority students who wish to pursue careers in aviation. And finally, we ask for a public apology to Lorenzo and myself, acknowledging the harm caused by this incident and the commitment to prevent such injustices from occurring again. The airline's attorney glanced at his team, then back at the judge, nodding in agreement. We accept these terms. The judge gave a pleased nod. Very well. This court will adjourn for a brief recess to formalize the agreement. He struck his gavel, and the room erupted in whispers and sighs of relief. The tension that had filled the air only moments before seemed to lift, replaced by an atmosphere of hope and triumph. As people began filing out, Lorenzo and Belinda hugged each other tightly, tears of relief and joy streaming down their faces. For Lorenzo, it felt as if a weight had been lifted, and he looked up at his aunt with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. You did it, Aunt Belinda, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Your bravery made this happen. Belinda shook her head, smiling through her own tears. No, sweetheart, we did this together. I couldn't have done any of it without you. As they broke apart, they noticed a crowd of reporters gathering outside the courtroom doors. Belinda looked down at Lorenzo, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Are you ready to face them? She asked softly. We can wait if you need a moment. Lorenzo took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and nodded. I'm ready. Let's go tell everyone that things are going to change. Hand in hand, they walked toward the doors, bracing themselves for the flood of questions and flashing cameras. When they stepped outside, they were met with a sea of microphones, cameras, and reporters eager to capture the moment. The buzz of excitement was palpable, and for the first time, Lorenzo felt a sense of pride as he faced the crowd. Belinda addressed the media first, her voice clear and unwavering. We have reached a settlement with the airline. They have agreed to our terms, which include mandatory diversity training, scholarships for minority students, and a public apology. This victory is not just for us, it's for everyone who has ever faced discrimination. We hope that this will lead to real change. The reporters erupted with questions, but Belinda held up her hand, signaling for quiet. She looked down at Lorenzo, encouraging him to speak. He took a small step forward, his voice steady as he spoke into the microphones. I hope this means no one else will have to go through what we did, he said. It's important to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. As they made their way through the crowd, Lorenzo felt an overwhelming sense of relief and pride. The battle they had fought for months was finally over, and they had won. He couldn't help but smile, thinking about all the good that would come from their efforts. He looked up at his aunt, who was beaming with pride, and felt a surge of gratitude for her strength and courage. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of their victory began to take shape. The airline issued a heartfelt public apology, acknowledging their mistakes and promising to do better. News reports covered the announcement, showing airline staff attending diversity training sessions and highlighting the new scholarship fund for aspiring minority students in aviation. Lorenzo watched these reports with a sense of pride, knowing that he had played a part in sparking change. One evening, as they watched yet another news segment about the positive changes happening in the airline industry, Lorenzo turned to Belinda, a question lingering in his mind. Do you think we really changed things? He asked softly. Belinda smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Yes, Lorenzo, we absolutely did. Sometimes it takes one brave person to stand up and say, this isn't right, to start a movement, and you were that brave person. Lorenzo felt a warm sense of pride wash over him. He had been through so much, from the humiliation on the plane to the nerve-wracking trial, but now he could see that it had all been worth it. They had made a difference, and that feeling was better than anything he could have imagined. In the weeks following the trial, Lorenzo and Belinda found themselves busier than ever. Their victory had sparked a nationwide conversation about discrimination in travel, and they were determined to keep the momentum going. Lorenzo, once shy and nervous, had blossomed into a confident young advocate. He spoke at schools, community centers, and even corporate events, sharing his story and urging others to stand up against injustice. At one school event, Lorenzo spoke to a packed auditorium of students, his voice clear and passionate. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he began, looking out at the sea of faces. "But sometimes life puts you in situations where you have to choose, stay quiet or speak up. I chose to speak up, and it changed everything." After his talk, a line of young people formed, each wanting to share their own experiences and thank him for his bravery. Lorenzo listened patiently, offering words of encouragement and support, his heart swelling with pride. Belinda watched from the side, her eyes misty with pride and admiration. She marveled at how far her nephew had come, from a nervous boy on a fateful flight to a young man who inspired countless others with his courage. Their advocacy work took them across the country, meeting people from all walks of life who shared their own stories of discrimination. Lorenzo's youthful perspective resonated deeply, especially with kids who saw themselves in him. At one event, a young girl approached him, her eyes shining with admiration. "I've been bullied because of how I look," she said quietly, "but hearing your story makes me want to stand up for myself." Lorenzo smiled, his voice gentle yet firm. "Your voice matters," he told her, "and when you use it, you'll be surprised at how many people will stand with you." As they traveled, Lorenzo and Belinda saw the ripple effects of their work. More people were coming forward, sharing their stories, and companies were taking notice, implementing new policies and training programs. They knew that their journey wasn't over, but they felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing they had made a real impact. As they boarded a flight back home, Lorenzo felt a familiar flutter of nerves. But as he looked around, he noticed something different: respectful nods, warm smiles, and genuine kindness from the airline staff. He glanced at his aunt, who gave him a reassuring smile. This time, he felt like he truly belonged. As the plane took off, Lorenzo gazed out the window, reflecting on the whirlwind journey that had brought him here. They had faced injustice head-on and emerged victorious, not just for themselves but for countless others. And as they soared above the clouds, he knew it was just the beginning of the change they would bring to the world. In the months following the trial, the impact of Lorenzo and Belinda's case continued to ripple across the nation. Airlines began implementing mandatory diversity training programs, and news stories highlighted the scholarship fund now available to minority students pursuing careers in aviation. It was a reminder of how one family's bravery had sparked a change that went far beyond a single courtroom. Lorenzo adjusted to his new role as a young advocate, speaking at schools and community events with a confidence that surprised even him. Each time he shared his story, he could see the impact in the eyes of those listening. His experiences had empowered others to stand up, and he felt proud knowing that their fight had inspired so many. One day, as they sat in a quiet moment together, Lorenzo looked over at Belinda. "Do you think this will really keep helping people?" he asked softly, his eyes thoughtful. Belinda smiled, her voice gentle yet certain. "Absolutely, Lorenzo. What we did will remind people that they deserve respect, that they have a right to be treated fairly." She paused, her gaze steady. "You showed them that even one voice can lead to something much bigger." Lorenzo felt a warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and relief. He had faced his fears, and together, he and Belinda had turned their painful experience into a call for change. And while he knew that the road toward justice would always have obstacles, he was ready to keep walking it. Lorenzo felt a warmth in his chest, a mix of pride and relief. He had faced his fears, and together he and Belinda had turned their painful experience into a call for change. And while he knew that the road toward justice would always have obstacles, he was ready to keep walking it. The day of the scholarship fund's official launch, Lorenzo spoke to a crowd of supporters, students, and mentors gathered to celebrate. He looked out at the sea of faces and took a deep breath. "I didn't expect to be here," he began, his voice carrying a calm strength. "But sometimes, standing up for what's right means stepping outside of your comfort zone. We have to keep pushing for fairness, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The audience responded with applause, and as he left the stage, Lorenzo was greeted by a line of young people waiting to talk with him, each with a story to tell or a thank you to offer. Belinda watched with pride as Lorenzo patiently listened, his kindness and empathy on full display. Later, as they boarded a flight home, Lorenzo noticed the respectful nods and warm smiles from the airline staff. The difference was stark, And as he settled into his seat, he knew that they had not just changed one policy, they had begun a movement. The world had started to listen. If you felt inspired by Lorenzo and Belinda's journey, know that you too can be a force for change. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to make a difference. Stand up, speak out, and let's keep building a world where everyone is treated with dignity. And for more stories that touch the heart and inspire change, make sure to subscribe and watch the next story that will leave you moved.